So this lecture is kind of an overview of the Russian Revolution. You should have read about it already, and we're going to look at some documents. So this is just a little bit of background to help you understand it a little bit more. We start back in 5.8 because that's really where the story of the revolution begins, but the main focus is going to be 7.4 in our book. So when we talk about Russia, we have to talk about it in the context of Eastern Europe, and this is Eastern Europe here. A lot of these countries are not controlled all the time by Russia, but are in what we would call Russia's sphere of influence. Russia has a lot of power over them and a lot of, obviously, influence over them. So what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to talk about how Russia was kind of behind the rest of Europe and how that affected it, and how the initial reaction and opposition to the czars began. So to begin, vocab, the czar is just the emperor of Russia. Tsarina means empress. The Duma, this is Russia's Congress. That's all that means, is it's Russia's Congress. And then a mutiny is when soldiers or sailors rebel against their government. So the Russian Empire, if you look up here in the right, the Russian Empire is one of the largest empires to ever exist. It's the largest country currently and back then to exist. It was ruled absolutely, just with an absolute iron fist, by a group of people called the Tsars. And the Tsars were the Romanov dynasty. That is the family who controlled Russia. In the 1800s, it is a rising power. It is behind the rest of Europe, but it is industrializing, and it had the biggest population. So think of Russia as sort of like a sleeping giant. If it could get it together, it probably will be one of the most powerful countries on the planet. The issue is that Russia is backwards. And I would say not even just socially backwards. It's economically backwards. It's militarily backwards. It's just not as advanced as the rest of Europe. They also have some issues where they're defeated in multiple wars we're going to see. You don't need to know the wars exactly, but you're going to see that they don't have a good record with war, and that makes the people not trust them. The Tsar does try to reform, but there keep being assassinations of the Tsar, which then make it so that it just kind of goes back and forth between, are we going to reform or are we not going to reform? So what happens is the people begin to lose faith in the Tsar, and this will eventually lead to the 1905 revolution. So we're not there yet, but we're explaining what led to it. So the Russians fight another war called the Russo-Japanese War. We went over this when we talked about imperialism, and they lose. They lose to the Japanese. There are huge economic issues. The economy is bad. Most of the people are in desperate poverty. And then the last thing that kind of leads to this is what's called Bloody Sunday. This is actually a pro-Tsar march led by the priests, the Russian Orthodox priests in the country. And the idea is they're going to march to the Tsar's palace, and they're going to present the Tsar with a list of complaints, and they want the Tsar to fix these complaints. The Tsar, though, put his general in charge, and the general opened fire on the crowd. This makes the people absolutely hate the Tsar. So these things all together, in history, not a lot of times does one thing cause a revolution. It's usually a whole group of things that are put together to cause a revolution. So all of these together lead to the 1905 revolution. The 1905 revolution is led by a few different groups of people, but one of the main one is going to be officers in the army. And the goal of it is to modernize and reform Russia. They want to fix the problems. So whole sections of the army and the navy mutiny against the government. Workers and peasants rise up. They attack people. The Tsar eventually does put the rebellion down, and he puts the rebellion down very harsh. He pretty much executes anybody who gets in his way. Cannons are brought into the streets to blow apart barricades like this. While the revolution isn't successful, it starts this process of questioning the Tsar. So the Tsar has to issue, because of this, what we call the October Manifesto, and it is reforms to try and update the Russian government. So he creates a Duma. This is a legislature where the people can vote representatives to help make laws. This goes completely against what the Tsars believe. And you have to remember, the Tsars are absolute monarchs. They want all control in their hands. This goes against this. He has to give the citizens rights. It goes against that absolute monarchy people. So while the Tsar holds his power, He continues to try and kind of weaken the Duma, but it's like the first chip in the armor of the Tsar. And we're going to see that he gets challenged more come World War I. So you want to think of like this. You got to think of it, how are the people expressing their anger towards the Tsar in 1905? So now we get to the main kind of thing that we're looking at, which is the actual Russian Revolution, which takes place in 7.4. So what we want to do here, we want to explain the causes of two revolutions. The Russian Revolution has a revolution inside of the revolution. We have the February Revolution and we have the October Revolution. You need to know the difference between those. We also need to look at the Civil War in Russia and then eventually how the Soviet Union is going to be developed. So again, we have the Duma as our vocab, the legislature of Russia. The proletariat, we've had this one before. This is what the communists refer to as the working class. We have a Soviet. This is a government council set up by the communists. So that's what they called their government councils. And then we've had this before, the means of production. Remember, they're the factories, the mines, the things that make the things that we need to survive. So, Russian Empire. After the 1905 revolution, the Russian Empire appeared very, very strong. It looked like it had modernized, it was slowly industrializing, but there were huge problems. Probably the biggest thing was the wealth inequality. This is how the czars and the nobles lived, absolute luxury, while most Russians lived like these peasants down here in total poverty. The new czar, Nicholas, he was a weak ruler. He couldn't make decisions. He, for the most part, was interested in running the country, but wasn't good at it. World War I was happening at this time, and Russia was, for all purposes, losing. The Germans were steadily taking Russian land, and probably the biggest problem was there was a famine. There were food shortages all over Russia, and there was not enough food. That leads us to the February Revolution of 1917. So you want to definitely make note that this revolution happens during World War I. So Russia's actively fighting World War I, and they're having a revolution. The reason for the February Revolution is the people simply lost faith in the Tsar. The Tsar had failed to reform the country. It was still almost like it was back in the 1300s. World War I was also going very poorly. The bodies were stacking up. Battles were being lost. The Tsar himself had gone to the front to try to lead the army, and it didn't work. So the soldiers now don't have a lot of faith in the Tsar. They don't believe that he's a good leader any longer. The economy had pretty much collapsed because of World War I. A lot of people didn't believe that World War I was worth it anymore, because when you can't have food, which is the next point, you're not going to want to fight a war. The last piece is Tsarina Alexandra, who was the Empress of Russia, was manipulated by a priest who you may have heard of called Rasputin. He pretty much had a cult at this point, and she believed that he could heal her son of a disease that he had. And people thought that Rasputin, not the Tsar, was running the government. And that, again, it causes people to lose faith in the Tsar. So here we have Rasputin, here we have the Tsar, we have the Tsarina, and then there is the Tsar leading the troops at the front. You can see it's very old-fashioned. The troops are bowing to the Tsar. This is not something that happens in the German armies or the British armies or the French armies. Russia is like 1300s, like they're back in the Middle Ages still in some ways. There's the Tsar and his family. This is one of the last known pictures to be taken, or one of the last pictures taken in their palace of them. So the February Revolution begins. It begins in Petrograd, which is one of the major cities in Russia, and it begins with food riots. There's not enough food. The people are sick of there not being enough food, and they begin to riot. The army is called in to put down the riot, and it switches sides. Then the army and the workers begin to form what we call a Soviet. So what you want to make note of here, this is where the communists come in. They begin to form their own government in the city of Petrograd. So now it's not just a riot, it's beginning to be kind of a challenge to the Tsar himself. So the results of the February Revolution, remember this is the first revolution that happens. One, the Tsar abdicates his throne. He is no longer Tsar. and it leads to what we call the dual government. And this means there are two governments trying to govern Russia. One is the Duma. The Duma is the elected assembly that the Tsar had set up, if you remember, made up of representatives for all over Russia. The other one is what we call the Petrograd Soviet, and that's the one down here. This is made up of the communists. Both of them say they're actually the government of Russia, and as you can imagine, that's not going to work. So the October Revolution is next. This happens after the February Revolution, and it is where the communists will take over the government. So the February Revolution leads to the downfall of the Tsar. The October Revolution leads to the rise of the communists. The reason for this revolution is Lenin, right there. He is the leader of the Bolsheviks. He wants the communists in charge. So he wants that Duma-Soviet rivalry ended, and he wants the communists to take over control of Russia. The Bolsheviks are a group of communists. So the communists in the Soviet are split between two groups, and we have them down here. The Bolsheviks are the group that wants to violently overthrow the Duma and turn Russia communist immediately. The Bolsheviks can pretty much be summed up by they want to execute the Tsar, execute the generals, execute the officers, execute the people who are in charge of the factories, execute anybody who is against them, execute the professors, execute the teachers, and immediately turn Russia communist. The other group are the Mensheviks, who gradually want to change Russia into a communist socialist country. The Bolsheviks think they're wrong, and they are going to lead this revolution against the Duma. So the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks take control of the government. They overthrow the Duma. They storm the palace where the Tsar is living with his family, and they place them under arrest. The result of this, the Bolsheviks are now fully in control of the Russian government, and they begin implementing their communist dream in Russia. So you can see just some of the revolution here. This picture down here is actually fairly interesting. You have the leaders of the Bolsheviks, but the important people, you have Lenin right here in the center, a guy named Trotsky, who'd be very important, and then Joseph Stalin, the future dictator of Russia. When the Bolsheviks overthrow the government, Russia is completely thrown into chaos. The Bolsheviks had kind of risen to power on this idea that they were going to end World War I. You have to remember that World War I was very, very unpopular among the Russian people. So they say, we're just going to end it. And they sign a treaty that gets Russia out of World War I, and in exchange it gives up a ton of land to the Germans, the Austrians, and the Ottomans. This then starts the Russian Civil War. The Russian Civil War is for control over the country and who is going to be the rightful government of Russia. We have two groups. We have the Red Russians and we have the White Russians. The Red Russians are just the communists. They're the Bolsheviks. They want to immediately implement communism, and they want to be really the only party that is in charge. The next group is the White Russians. The White Russians are not a single group. They are a collection of various groups. Some of them are counter-revolutionaries. They just don't like communism. Some of them are czarists. They want the Tsar to come back. Some of them are the Mensheviks, who disagree with the Bolsheviks but still want communism. Some of them are Democrats who want a democracy. And the Whites, the issue, they're going to fight each other just as much as they fight the Bolsheviks. So you can see here is the treaty. Russia agrees to give up all this land to Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire in exchange for getting out of the war. So the White Russians. The White Russians are probably the more confusing side. They are that loose coalition of anti-communists. Again, a lot of times they fight each other just as much as they fight the actual Red Russians. They received support after World War I, and a little bit during, I guess, from the Allies. So that picture there is actually the American soldiers in Russia to help the White Russians. They don't really do anything. It doesn't help that much, But this is going to make the Red Russians distrust the Allies because they were supporting their enemies. Eventually, what begins to happen, the White Russians are divided, they're defeated one by one, and slowly they are crushed. The Red Russians are extremely unified. They're unified under a dictatorship, essentially. They control the very populated parts of Russia, which is going to help them a lot during the war. And they take total control of society. They become a total dictatorship that has all say over everything. They have a secret police called the Cheka. They hunt down and they kill anybody who is against the Bolsheviks. Eventually, they will even execute the Tsar and the royal family in 1918. They tell the Tsar and his family they're going to take their portrait, take them down into a basement, and then they execute all of them. They adopt what's called war communism, where all food, this is like ultimate communism, all food, all industry works for the war. The government is in control of all of it. Because of these reasons, the communists win the Civil War by 1921, and Russia is unified under the Bolshevik communism. So if you see, this is just some propaganda from the time period. This is supposed to be how the whites viewed the Russians. They were a danger that needs to be killed and destroyed and unify Russia. But the whites were never really able to do this. So after the Civil War, in 1922, this Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, is founded. The USSR is a communist nation, and it can be kind of confusing. It is a country made up of a bunch of different Soviet communist republics. So think of how the United States is made up of states. The Soviet Union is made up of a bunch of different countries. It looks democratic, but not really, because the Communist Party was the only party allowed. And throughout its entire existence, this is going to be really important. The Communist Party crushes any dissent. They're the only ones allowed. So yes, you can vote, but you can only vote for the Communist Party. The means of production, the factories and stuff, they do go to the workers, but they're controlled by the Communist Party. There are no rights. Your mail is opened, phone lines are tapped, everything is monitored, right? The big thing is the most important country was Russia, and it's going to dominate all the other countries in the USSR. So this is the USSR. This is like if you're looking down from the North Pole. So you have Russia as the biggest part of the USSR, but all these nations are also part of the USSR. They're just dominated by Russia. Eventually what happens is Lenin gets very sick and begins to die. And with Lenin dying, there is a question of who will be in charge of the USSR. And the main argument comes between Trotsky and Stalin. So Stalin wants to focus on just communism in the USSR. He wants to build the USSR up, make it a very strong country that can compete with the capitalist democracies. Trotsky wants to continue the Russian Revolution, but spread it worldwide. He wants to try and get the whole world to come over to this socialist communist utopia. There's Stalin over here. Here's Trotsky over here. This is kind of ends our current view of the Russian Revolution. I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler. Stalin wins. He becomes the dictator of the Soviet Union, and he has Trotsky assassinated to eliminate any kind of threat to his power. So I hope that helps you understand the Russian Revolution. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.